Between the years 1832 and 1863, an eerie and unnerving series of deaths occurred across 5 southern states, with at least 250 white men involved in the slave system being killed under strange, unexplainable circumstances. The victims of these deaths were not random, but were all deeply entrenched in the institution of slavery. Overseers, plantation owners, slave traders, federal marshals, and other figures who profited from or enforced the system of human bondage. These deaths were not only widespread, but also connected by a pattern that authorities at the time failed to recognize, or perhaps chose to ignore. Official investigations were cursory at best, and no one ever connected these deaths to a larger scheme, leaving a trail of bodies that seemed to vanish into the ether of history. The deaths themselves were peculiar in the extreme. Some men were found hanged, seemingly by their own hands, in barns, warehouses, or other remote locations. Yet upon closer examination, there were often signs that these deaths were not suicides, but murders staged to look like suicides. The most significant of these signs was the discovery of bound hands. Many of the victims' hands were found tied behind their backs, which raised an important question. How could a person tie their own hands behind their back and then hang themselves? The idea of self-inflicted suicide in this manner was not just improbable, it was physically impossible. This inconsistency was ignored by local authorities, who were either too quick to close cases or too unwilling to dig deeper. The bodies were buried, and life on the plantations carried on, undisturbed by the shadow of this mysterious wave of deaths. Other victims were discovered in ways that defied natural explanation. Some drowned in shallow creeks or ponds, where the water was too shallow to have caused their deaths. Others simply disappeared, leaving no trace behind except for their abandoned horses and unclaimed weapons. For years, these cases went uninvestigated or were dismissed as natural occurrences, accidents, or the result of personal misfortune. Plantation owners, overseers, and local sheriffs often dismissed these deaths as the inevitable byproducts of dangerous work, excessive drinking, or poor decisions. A man who fell off a barn's upper rack and broke his neck was simply a victim of the dangerous nature of work on a plantation. A man who drowned in a creek that wasn't deep enough to drown him was presumed to have been drunk or careless. There was a willingness to explain these deaths away as nothing more than unfortunate incidents, yet it was becoming clear to a small circle of people that something darker was at play. The geographical span of these deaths was vast. From Virginia down to Louisiana, they affected multiple states and numerous plantations, suggesting that the killings were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a larger and much more deliberate campaign. The victims represented the pillars of the Southern economy, those who profited directly from the suffering of enslaved people, and this connection between the deaths and the Southern slave system was no coincidence. The death toll was alarming, yet no pattern was ever acknowledged. No formal investigation ever connected the dots, and no arrests were ever made. These deaths, while alarming, were dismissed by authorities who refused to see them as part of any larger, coordinated act of rebellion or resistance. The idea that someone, perhaps a single individual, could be responsible for these deaths was too unsettling for many to comprehend. Instead of investigating the deaths as a coordinated effort, local authorities, law enforcement, and plantation owners alike tried to fit the deaths into a framework they understood: isolated incidents. To acknowledge the possibility that someone might be systematically targeting those who enforced the system of slavery would have been to acknowledge that their entire way of life was vulnerable. It would have meant admitting that the slave system was not invulnerable, that it could be challenged and broken from within. And this was an idea that most plantation owners were unwilling to entertain. The more convenient narrative was one of disjointed accidents and personal misfortunes. One of the most unsettling aspects of these deaths was the absolute silence surrounding them. Though they occurred across multiple plantations and in numerous regions of the South, there were no whistleblowers, no conspirators who came forward with information, no witnesses to provide testimony. Those who were connected to these deaths, the enslaved people on the plantations, kept quiet. In many cases, they saw the deaths not as tragic events, but as a form of justice, a form of payback for the brutality and oppression they had suffered at the hands of the victims. While plantation owners, overseers, and local law enforcement scoured the plantations for leads, the enslaved communities remained resolute in their silence. They did not speak, not out of fear of retribution, but out of a quiet solidarity, a collective understanding that the deaths were a form of resistance, one that they were not willing to betray. It is important to recognize that these deaths, while isolated in their investigation and explanation, represent something much deeper, a profound vulnerability in the slave system. These deaths were a direct consequence of the cruelty and inhumanity of the system itself. They were not accidents or the natural outcomes of labor in the fields. They were targeted killings designed to send a message. But to whom? And why were they happening? These deaths seemed to be happening in places where cruelty was the worst, where plantation owners and overseers were known for their brutal treatment of enslaved people. Those responsible for the killings were not just targeting individuals, but the system itself. The killings, in many ways, were a form of organized resistance, aimed at removing the worst offenders from the system, men who were directly responsible for the physical and psychological abuse of enslaved people. As the deaths continued, some began to whisper that they were not the result of random chance, but rather the actions of an individual or group dedicated to eliminating the worst of the slave system. The killings were surgical in their precision, with each death occurring at just the right moment, with no signs of forced entry, and often with the deaths appearing to be from natural causes. The murders themselves were so well executed that it seemed as though someone with deep knowledge of the system, someone who understood the vulnerabilities of the slaveholders, was orchestrating them. But despite these suspicions, no one could identify the perpetrator, and the killings went unpunished. The death toll continued to rise, and the authorities in the South seemed to grow more desperate as the murders seemed to escalate. Some plantation owners took to hiring private detectives, while others simply increased security on their properties. But the fear remained palpable. Who was this person who seemed to have unlimited access to the southern plantations? Who could infiltrate the system, observe the operations of these plantations, and remove the worst perpetrators with such ease? It was clear to those who were paying attention that this was not a random act of violence, but rather a carefully calculated campaign of justice, one that aimed to bring down the oppressors of the South slave system, one life at a time. In the end, the deaths remained largely unexplained, with many of them dismissed as accidental or natural by authorities, too invested in maintaining the status quo to recognize the deeper implications of these killings. But the enslaved communities understood the true meaning of these deaths. To them, these were not random tragedies, but acts of resistance and retribution. And while they may have remained silent to protect the identity of the person, or persons, responsible, the deaths were understood as part of a much larger struggle, one in which the victims of the system would not go down without a fight. The mystery of these deaths continues to haunt the history of slavery in the United States, not only because of the loss of life, but also because of the way they reveal the vulnerabilities of a system that many believed to be unbreakable. The deaths represent a kind of justice that was both deeply personal and deeply political, a statement against the cruelty and inhumanity of the slave system that was too dangerous for authorities to confront. In the end, the mysterious deaths in the South were not merely accidents or random events. They were a form of resistance, one that, although not officially recognized, had a profound impact on the lives of those who lived through it. In the heart of the antebellum South, a shadow moved through the plantations, leaving a trail of death in its wake. The name that echoed through the hushed whispers of the enslaved communities and the nervous conversations of the white plantation owners was Moses. He was a man whose presence seemed to both terrify and inspire. His story, though shrouded in myth and mystery, holds a central place in the history of resistance within the oppressive system of slavery. This man, known by various names but most frequently as Daniel or Moses, was not just a figure of violence, he was a symbol of defiance, a living, breathing manifestation of the enslaved people's ability to fight back against their oppressors, even in the most ruthless ways imaginable. Daniel's life began, like the lives of so many enslaved people, in anonymity. He was brought to Richmond, Virginia in 1832 as an enslaved man sold at auction. There, in the oppressive heat of a summer morning, he stood before prospective buyers. In the ledger, he was simply listed as Daniel, a description that highlighted his physical strength but provided little more. At 28 years old, he was strong, healthy, and capable of hard labor. The auctioneer's notes mention nothing of his character, his intelligence, or his resolve. They only described his physique, the prime field hand, with no defects, listed, an assessment that marked him as a valuable asset in the unforgiving world of Southern slavery. His buyer, a tobacco plantation owner named Marcus Whitfield, paid $950 for Daniel, who was immediately taken to Ashford Plantation, situated about 40 miles west of Richmond. At Ashford, Daniel joined the ranks of enslaved field workers, tasked with cultivating the land for tobacco. While he initially appeared to be just another enslaved man, an unremarkable addition to the workforce, he was far from ordinary. What none of his overseers or fellow slaves knew was that Daniel was already plotting something much larger than mere survival. He was studying the world around him, learning everything he could about the plantation, its routines, its vulnerabilities, and its weaknesses. As he settled into the brutal routine of forced labor at Ashford, Daniel's intelligence and patience began to shine through. He worked alongside other enslaved people, enduring the backbreaking labor of tobacco cultivation. The work was endless, grinding from dawn till dusk, involving planting, weeding, topping the plants, harvesting, and curing the leaves. The overseers were ruthless, maintaining control through fear and violence, using whips and threats to keep the enslaved people in line. Daniel, however, did not engage in rebellion or resistance at first. He followed the orders, keeping his head down and remaining invisible to his masters. But in this silence, he was biding his time. Every day he was learning, observing, and internalizing everything about his environment. He memorized the layout of the plantation, the schedules of the overseers, the patrol routes, and even the habits of the men who ran the estate. He also learned which of the enslaved workers were particularly vulnerable and which ones were strong and capable of resistance. Daniel, though seemingly docile on the surface, was forming a plan. By November 1832, Daniel had spent 3 months at Ashford, observing everything and everyone. He had developed a keen understanding of the power dynamics at play, and was now ready to act. His first target was William Cobb, one of the overseers at Ashford. Cobb had a reputation for cruelty, and it was well known that he used his hickory cane to strike workers, particularly when they were slow or disobedient. Daniel, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity. One night, after Cobb had been working late in the tobacco curing barn, Daniel executed his first move. Cobb was found dead the following morning, his body lying in the dirt with a broken neck from a fall. The official report stated that Cobb had fallen from a high rack while inspecting the tobacco leaves. It was a tragic accident, so the authorities concluded, but no one suspected foul play. Cobb's body was quickly buried, and life at Ashford continued as usual. However, the enslaved people at the plantation knew differently. They understood that this was not an accident, but a calculated move in a larger struggle. The murder of Cobb was just the beginning of a more methodical campaign of resistance that would span years and involve multiple plantations across the South. Over the next several months, the cycle would repeat itself. Another overseer, named Peterson, vanished without a trace. Peterson had been a brutal taskmaster, known for his harsh treatment of the enslaved workers. He disappeared one night, and despite a search by Whitfield and the other overseers, no trace of him was ever found. Rumors circulated among the enslaved community that Daniel had been involved, but these were never confirmed. Daniel, once again, had executed his plan flawlessly. No one could prove anything, but the sense of fear among the plantation owners was growing. In 1833, another overseer named Dutch met a similar fate. Dutch was found dead in the fields, apparently from heat stroke, but the circumstances surrounding his death raised questions. His water flask was found to contain a bitter substance, and some workers began to suspect that Daniel had poisoned him. Once again, the authorities chalked it up to a tragic but natural cause. Daniel, ever the shadow, continued to evade detection. Each death seemed like an isolated incident, but to those who were paying attention, a pattern was emerging. Daniel was systematically eliminating the worst offenders, those who were most brutal in their treatment of enslaved people. In every plantation he entered, Daniel followed the same routine. He would arrive, blend in with the other enslaved workers, and go about his duties quietly. He would observe the overseers, learning their habits, studying their weaknesses. Then, when the opportunity presented itself, he would strike, usually without leaving a trace. His targets were always the cruelest overseers or the most brutal slave catchers. The deaths seemed random, but they were part of a larger, methodical campaign. For Daniel, these deaths were not murders for the sake of violence. They were acts of resistance, an attempt to bring justice to those who had suffered under the yoke of slavery. As Daniel's campaign continued, plantation owners began to grow suspicious. They had noticed that whenever Daniel was sold, a series of deaths would follow in his wake. The overseers, the slave catchers, and the merchants who had made a living off the system of slavery all seemed to fall victim to unexplained deaths. Yet, despite the growing evidence, no one could catch him. He moved through the plantations like a ghost, blending in with the other enslaved people, and never staying in one place long enough to be caught. His methods were so precise that even the most experienced detectives and lawmen could not figure out how he was committing the killings. The more authorities looked into the deaths, the more they realized that they were up against an invisible enemy. Someone who understood the system and knew how to exploit its vulnerabilities. The more Daniel moved from plantation to plantation, the more the system seemed to crack. It was becoming clear that there was a vulnerability within the structure of slavery that no one had expected. Despite their physical power and control, the slaveholders and overseers were not invincible. They could be targeted, they could be killed, and they had no way of protecting themselves from the very people they enslaved. Daniel had learned to move within the system, to adapt to it, and to use it against itself. He had become a master of subterfuge, operating in plain sight yet always remaining undetected. His ability to navigate the complexities of the slave system was nothing short of extraordinary. By the time Daniel was sold again in 1834 to a rice plantation in South Carolina, his legend had already begun to grow. Enslaved people across the South knew of him, and whispers of his deeds had spread like wildfire. He had become a symbol of hope, a figure of resistance against the tyranny of the slave system. To those who had suffered under the brutal system of slavery, Daniel was more than just a killer. He was a deliverer of justice, a man who had made the oppressors pay for their sins. Though he was seen as a criminal by the authorities, to the enslaved people, he was a hero. His acts of violence were seen as righteous, necessary, and a form of retribution for the countless injustices committed against the enslaved population. Daniel's movement across plantations was not only a series of killings, but a statement about the vulnerabilities of the system of slavery. His ability to strike fear into the hearts of plantation owners, slave traders, and overseers revealed just how fragile the entire system was. As he continued his campaign, Daniel proved that the enslaved people were not powerless. They were not broken. They could fight back, and they could do so in ways that even the most powerful men in the South could not anticipate. Daniel was not just a symbol of vengeance. He was a symbol of resistance. One that showed the world that even the most oppressed people could take control of their own fate. Despite his growing reputation, Daniel's true identity remained elusive. Whether he was one man or several people acting in concert, the story of Moses became a legend that lived on in the memories of those who had witnessed his actions. The fear he instilled in the Southern elite was not just about the deaths he caused, but about the broader implications of what those deaths meant. They were a sign that the system of slavery, with all its power and might, could be brought down from within. Daniel, or Moses, was the living embodiment of that threat, and for years, he moved through the South, delivering justice to those who had profited from human suffering. The Southern plantation system was built upon an intricate structure of fear, control, and submission. Plantation owners, overseers, and other figures of authority wielded absolute power over the enslaved people who worked their fields, homes, and businesses. They were the masters of a brutal system that saw the forced labor of millions, and their authority was considered unassailable. At least, it was believed to be. For decades, the Southern elites lived their lives in a constant state of dominance and security, convinced that the enslaved people who toiled under their rule could never truly threaten their positions or their way of life. However, the mysterious deaths of at least 250 white men between 1832 and 1863, each one linked in some way to the system of slavery, began to unravel this carefully constructed illusion of invulnerability. The deaths, occurring with unsettling regularity and in increasingly suspicious circumstances, struck at the very heart of the plantation owners' sense of security. These deaths were not merely accidents, natural occurrences, or the unfortunate results of dangerous working conditions. They were targeted killings, executed with surgical precision, and with the goal of eliminating specific individuals who were perceived as symbols of oppression. The psychological toll of these deaths on the plantation owners was profound. They had been used to being in control, used to being feared by those they enslaved, but the deaths made them realize something terrifying: they were vulnerable. They were no longer the untouchable, omnipotent figures they had believed themselves to be. For years, Southern plantation owners and overseers had lived with the assumption that their power was absolute. They were the masters, and the enslaved people were their property, nothing more than tools for labor. This sense of power and control was reinforced by the brutal methods of punishment and intimidation that were routinely employed to keep the enslaved population in line. The lash of the whip, the public flogging, the separation of families, all of these were designed to reinforce the idea that the masters held the power and the enslaved had none. The system was built on fear, not just of punishment, but of the complete dehumanization of the enslaved individuals, who were denied the most basic rights and freedoms. But the deaths began to disrupt this narrative. At first, the plantation owners dismissed the first few deaths as isolated incidents, misfortunes, or accidents that could be easily explained away. A man who falls from a high rack while inspecting tobacco leaves is just a victim of workplace hazards. Another man found drowned in a creek that wasn't deep enough to drown him must have been drunk or careless. The system of slavery was brutal, but it had worked for so long that it seemed invincible, even in the face of these strange deaths. The overwhelming belief was that nothing could shake the foundation of the Southern economy. However, as more deaths occurred, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the growing pattern. The men who were dying, overseers, slave traders, plantation managers, and even lawmen, were not random figures. They were key players in the system of slavery. They were the enforcers, the ones who carried out the orders that kept the enslaved population oppressed. As the victims of these killings accumulated, the connection between the deaths and the institution of slavery became clear. Someone was targeting the very people who upheld the system of human bondage. And the realization that these individuals were being killed with such precision began to eat away at the mental fortitude of the plantation owners. The first real signs of panic began when the deaths started to involve overseers, those who had the most direct control over the enslaved population. Overseers were the enforcers of the master's will, using violence and intimidation to maintain order and extract labor from the enslaved people. They were, in many ways, the embodiment of the system's cruelty, and they were the first to be targeted. The deaths of these men, found hanged, drowned, or simply missing, shattered the illusion of invulnerability that had been built into the plantation system. The owners began to realize that their ability to control their property, their workforce, was no longer absolute. Fear spread quickly through the ranks of the plantation elite. It was not just the deaths themselves that caused anxiety, but the manner in which they were happening. These were not simple murders committed out of personal grievance or chance. The killings were deliberate and calculated, executed with an intelligence and foresight that plantation owners had not anticipated from their enslaved workforce. No one could figure out how the killer, later known as Moses, was able to infiltrate their plantations, observe their routines, and eliminate his targets without being caught. The idea that someone within their system of control could strike back so effectively was something plantation owners had never considered. It was not just a challenge to their physical safety, but to their mental and emotional well-being. How could they go on living in a world where they could no longer count on their own power? As the deaths continued, some plantation owners began to act out of fear, increasing their security measures and surrounding themselves with armed guards. The thought of being vulnerable, of being a target, was unthinkable, but it was now a reality. In many cases, plantation owners began sleeping with loaded weapons by their sides. They fortified their homes, adding locks, bars, and shutters to ensure that no one could enter without their knowledge. But despite these efforts, the fear remained. Every day brought the possibility that the next victim would be one of them. And that uncertainty gnawed at their peace of mind. The power they had so long taken for granted was no longer a given. Their world was falling apart, piece by piece, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The most chilling aspect of this psychological unraveling was the growing sense of paranoia among the plantation owners. They no longer trusted their workers, their overseers, or anyone within their ranks. The killings made them question whether their own employees, the very people they considered property, could be behind the deaths. They began to look at everyone with suspicion. Every enslaved person became a potential threat, and the fear that someone within their own household or workforce could be plotting their demise created an atmosphere of tension and distrust. The idea of rebellion, once a distant concern, now felt immediate and real. It was no longer something that only happened in distant regions or in the abstract. It was happening right in front of them. This fear of rebellion, of an organized resistance that could tear down the system of slavery, became the driving force behind many of the actions taken by the plantation owners during this time. They began to take more extreme measures to control their enslaved workforce. The whippings became more frequent and brutal. Family separations were carried out with increasing cruelty. Plantation owners sought to assert their authority through ever more violent means, hoping to crush any potential resistance before it could take root. But these measures only fueled the fear. They did not eliminate it. In fact, they may have exacerbated it, making the enslaved population more determined to strike back against their oppressors. The sense of fear was not confined to the plantations alone. The deaths had a ripple effect that spread through the South, affecting not just the plantation owners, but the entire social structure that had been built around slavery. The system of slavery was not just an economic arrangement. It was a social order, a hierarchy that placed white people at the top and black people at the bottom. The deaths of overseers and slave traders struck at the core of this hierarchy. The very people who upheld the social order were being eliminated one by one, and the authorities were powerless to stop it. This exposed a fundamental vulnerability in the system. Slavery was built on the premise of total control, but when that control was threatened, the system itself began to unravel. In response to this rising fear, the Southern elite sought to create a narrative of their own. They worked to downplay the significance of the deaths, dismissing them as random acts of violence or the result of personal grievances. But privately, they knew better. They knew that these deaths represented something much more dangerous, a direct challenge to their power. The fear that had begun to take root in the plantation houses of the South slowly spread to the highest echelons of society. Southern leaders, once confident in their ability to maintain control, began to question the stability of their entire way of life. The fear of the unknown, the fear that the next death could be their own, kept them up at night and made them rethink their strategies of control. As the years passed, the deaths continued, and the psychological toll on the plantation owners only deepened. They could no longer live in the illusion of invulnerability. Every death was a reminder that their control was not absolute. The once unshakable power of the plantation system had been exposed as fragile. and the men who had once believed they were untouchable began to realize that they were very much at risk. The deaths, though never fully understood or acknowledged by the authorities, had achieved something profound. They had broken the psychological armor of the Southern elite, forcing them to live in fear of the very system they had created. The deaths of overseers, traders, and plantation owners marked the beginning of a psychological shift that reverberated across the South. It was a slow erosion of the mental fortitude of the Southern elite, and it left them vulnerable in ways they had never before experienced. The fear that spread through the Southern aristocracy was a silent victory for the enslaved people, for it revealed that even in the face of overwhelming oppression, the system was not invulnerable. And though the deaths eventually ceased, the psychological scars left behind by those years of fear and uncertainty would linger long after the system of slavery itself came to an end. History is often written by the victors, and in the case of slavery in the antebellum South, much of the narrative surrounding the system of slavery has been deliberately shaped, distorted, or erased to suit the interests of those in power. The legacy of slavery in America is marked by this phenomenon of historical amnesia, an intentional or unintentional process by which uncomfortable truths are suppressed, glossed over, or forgotten. The story of Moses, the elusive figure who was responsible for the deaths of at least 2 to 50 white men involved in the slave system between 1832 and 1863, is an example of this historical amnesia at work. While the deaths themselves are widely ignored, even by historians, the implications of these events are far-reaching, as they represent a collective refusal to confront the full scope of resistance to slavery and the unacknowledged agency of enslaved people. At the time these events unfolded, those in power, plantation owners, law enforcement officials, and other figures who profited from the system of slavery, had a vested interest in maintaining the narrative that enslaved people were passive, helpless victims who waited for white abolitionists to free them. The idea that enslaved people could take matters into their own hands, organize, and actively resist the brutal system of slavery was not one that fit within the narrative of white benevolence and supremacy. To acknowledge that enslaved individuals could, and did, wage a secret, violent war against their oppressors would undermine the carefully constructed justification for slavery and the racial hierarchy that sustained it. The deaths associated with Moses were not random acts of violence or the actions of an isolated individual. They were part of a larger, coordinated resistance, a resistance that was both tactical and strategic, targeted at the men who represented the worst of the Southern system of slavery. The fact that these killings were not widely investigated or acknowledged by authorities reflects a broader effort to suppress the true nature of slavery as it existed in the South. The systematic elimination of overseers, slave traders, and plantation owners by a figure who moved invisibly through the landscape was not just an isolated rebellion. It was a direct challenge to the entrenched power structure that relied on the brutal exploitation of enslaved people. Yet, despite the widespread recognition within enslaved communities that Moses was an agent of justice, this story has been largely buried in the historical record. This erasure of resistance, particularly violent resistance, is part of a broader pattern of historical amnesia that has been prevalent in the United States. For decades, the historical narrative surrounding slavery has been framed in a way that downplays or ignores the agency of enslaved people, presenting them instead as helpless victims in need of a savior. This narrative has been perpetuated by a variety of means, including the creation of myths about the benevolence of Southern plantation owners, the erasure of the violence inherent in the system of slavery, and the suppression of stories like Moses's that challenge the prevailing understanding of the antebellum South. In the years following the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the dominant narrative was one of reconciliation and healing. The horrors of slavery were acknowledged, but only in a way that sought to mitigate the lasting effects of the institution. The brutal realities of slavery were often framed in terms that made it easier for the American public to accept, focusing on the suffering of enslaved people without confronting the complex, violent ways in which they fought back against their oppressors. The narrative of the benevolent white master and the passive, docile enslaved person became the dominant image of slavery, one that sought to explain away the more uncomfortable aspects of the history, such as the existence of violent resistance. One of the most striking examples of this historical amnesia is the erasure of stories of enslaved people's agency and their resistance to the system of slavery. The very idea that a figure like Moses could exist, someone who not only resisted but actively took lives in retaliation for the brutalities of slavery, has been downplayed, dismissed, or ignored in most historical accounts of the period. In part, this erasure stems from the uncomfortable truth that the slave system, while built on violence and terror, was also vulnerable to attack. Enslaved people were not simply passive victims. Many actively fought back in ways that were hidden from the larger society. These acts of resistance, whether through rebellion, escape, or, in the case of Moses, targeted killings, were viewed as threats to the social order and were therefore silenced or ignored. The story of Moses is not one that fits neatly into the narrative of slavery as it has been traditionally understood in the United States. It is a story that challenges the very foundation of the racial hierarchy that underpinned the institution of slavery. To acknowledge the existence of someone like Moses, someone who systematically targeted and killed figures of authority within the slave system, would be to confront the idea that the enslaved population was capable of organizing and taking action against their oppressors. It would mean acknowledging that enslaved people were not simply victims of a brutal system, but active agents in their own liberation, using whatever means necessary to fight back against the violence that was inflicted upon them. This is where historical amnesia comes into play. The story of Moses, like many other stories of resistance, has been largely forgotten because it does not fit into the comfortable narrative that has been constructed around slavery in the United States. To acknowledge the full scope of resistance to slavery would be to confront uncomfortable truths about the system itself and the ways in which it was maintained through violence, exploitation, and terror. It would require a reckoning with the fact that enslaved people were not helpless. They were powerful in ways that threatened the very foundation of the institution. The role of historical amnesia is not just about the erasure of certain stories. It is about the larger effort to maintain a narrative that allows for the continued dominance of the power structures that upheld slavery. By downplaying or ignoring the acts of resistance that were carried out by enslaved people, historians and society at large have been able to maintain the myth of white benevolence and superiority. This myth, which portrayed enslaved people as grateful for their masters' kindness, allowed the system of slavery to persist for as long as it did. It was only after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery that the narrative began to shift. But even then, the full complexity of slavery and the resistance to it was not fully acknowledged. The story of Moses is an important reminder that the history of slavery is not just a story of victimhood, but a story of resistance, of people who fought back against the oppression they faced. This resistance came in many forms, some subtle, some violent, some public, and some hidden. Moses' story is just one example of this, and yet it is a story that has been largely ignored or suppressed by historians and society alike. The silencing of this story is part of a larger pattern of historical amnesia that has persisted for generations, preventing us from fully understanding the complexity of slavery and its aftermath. In recent years, there has been a growing movement among historians, educators, and activists to recover these lost stories and challenge the sanitized version of slavery that has been perpetuated for so long. This movement seeks to highlight the agency of enslaved people and their acts of resistance, recognizing that slavery was not simply a system of oppression, but a system that was also challenged from within. By recovering these stories, we can gain a fuller understanding of the history of slavery and its legacy, one that acknowledges the full humanity and resistance of enslaved people. The erasure of stories like Moses's also points to a larger societal issue, the need to confront uncomfortable truths about the past. The history of slavery in the United States is not one that is easy to face, but it is one that must be acknowledged in its full complexity. We must recognize that enslaved people were not merely victims, but active agents in their own survival and resistance. To do otherwise is to perpetuate the historical amnesia that has long characterized the narrative of slavery in America. Ultimately, the story of Moses is not just a story of one man's resistance. It is a story of the resilience and strength of the enslaved population as a whole. It is a reminder that even in the most brutal systems of oppression, people find ways to fight back. And as we recover these lost stories, we can begin to understand the true depth of resistance to slavery and the power that enslaved people had to shape their own destinies, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The years between 1832 and 1841 saw an unsettling and unexplained series of deaths that continued to baffle plantation owners, local authorities, and law enforcement across the southern United States. Between 1832 and 1836, overseers, slave traders, and other figures of authority involved in the institution of slavery were found dead under suspicious circumstances. Though authorities claimed these were either accidents or natural causes, it became increasingly difficult for those in the Southern elite to ignore that a pattern was emerging. Despite this mounting evidence, no one could provide a concrete explanation for the deaths. This growing concern about the unexplained killings led to the intervention of a private investigator hired by Southern plantation owners to uncover the truth behind the deaths. This investigator was Amos Fairchild, a former Pinkerton detective with a reputation for solving difficult cases. Amos Fairchild was hired by a group of wealthy plantation owners in 1841 to investigate the mysterious deaths that had plagued their community. These plantation owners had been dealing with an increasing sense of fear and paranoia as overseers, slave traders, and other figures of authority had been mysteriously dying, one after another. Their deaths occurred in circumstances that defied easy explanation, leading many to suspect that someone was targeting them, a theory that many found impossible to prove. To deal with this rising fear, they turned to Fairchild, a detective who had built a reputation for solving complex and challenging cases, though none had quite the weight of the one now before him. Fairchild's task was monumental. The plantation owners had no concrete evidence to link these deaths, and the nature of the killings made it impossible for authorities to draw any definitive conclusions. They were all deaths within the upper echelons of the slave-owning class: overseers, merchants, slave traders, and plantation owners, people who had been instrumental in maintaining the slave system. The victims' deaths varied, but many shared a disturbing similarity. Their deaths appeared to be accidents or the result of natural causes, yet upon closer inspection, the circumstances surrounding their deaths seemed strangely suspicious. Some were found hanged, some drowned, others simply disappeared, their bodies never found. Each of these deaths occurred in a way that was consistent with foul play, but was cleverly disguised to look like accidents or natural events. Fairchild's investigation would need to connect these deaths and uncover the mysterious figure behind them. Fairchild began his investigation by reviewing the available evidence, which included death certificates, autopsy reports, and police records. He pored over the details of each death, speaking with local law enforcement, witnesses, and the families of the victims. What he uncovered during his investigation was unsettling. Fairchild found that these deaths were not random, nor were they merely the unfortunate result of a dangerous and brutal system. The deaths formed a pattern. Each occurred on a plantation where specific figures of authority, such as overseers or merchants involved in the slave trade, were present. What seemed like random deaths to the outside world began to look like something far more calculated. Amos Fairchild's breakthrough came when he began to trace the movements of one individual across multiple plantations. His investigation uncovered a strange coincidence in each case. Daniel, the enslaved man who was sold from plantation to plantation, had been present at the site of each death shortly before it occurred. In his review of plantation records, Fairchild found that this man, known only as Daniel in the auction ledgers, had been sold across 12 different plantations over a period of several years. In each of these locations, deaths had occurred under suspicious circumstances. This was no longer just a series of unrelated deaths. It appeared that Daniel, or whoever he truly was was somehow connected to each of these incidents. Fairchild's investigation led him to an alarming conclusion. This man, Daniel, whom he suspected was no ordinary enslaved worker, was not merely involved in these deaths, but was likely the individual behind them. Fairchild hypothesized that Daniel was not just an observer of the system of slavery, but an active participant in a secret campaign of resistance. He believed that this man had been systematically eliminating the worst offenders within the slave system, the overseers who brutalized enslaved people, the merchants who trafficked in human lives, and the plantation owners who profited from the exploitation of others. Daniel, or the figure known as Moses, was no mere runaway or fugitive. He was a deliberate and methodical assassin, one who had learned to navigate the slave system's vulnerabilities and use them to his advantage. Fairchild was not the first person to recognize the pattern of these deaths, though he was one of the few to investigate them systematically. Whispers had long circulated in the enslaved communities about the mysterious figure who had been targeting cruel overseers and slave traders. These stories spoke of a man who moved from plantation to plantation, striking at those who represented the worst aspects of the Southern slave system. The enslaved people, who had suffered under the brutality of their masters for generations, had begun to see this figure as a kind of avenger, someone who was delivering justice for the wrongs that had been done to them. But it was only through Fairchild's investigation that the full scale of this campaign of resistance came into focus. The most striking element of Fairchild's investigation was the pattern of Daniel's movements. He discovered that Daniel was sold from plantation to plantation, moving across the South like a shadow, blending in with the other enslaved people, and becoming virtually invisible to those who lived under the illusion that they were in control. What made Daniel so effective in his campaign of resistance was his ability to observe without being seen, to learn the habits of his targets without arousing suspicion. He was not just killing randomly, but carefully selecting his targets based on their role in the slave system. The overseers, the merchants, and the traders. These were the individuals who had the most direct impact on the lives of the enslaved people. By targeting them, Daniel was striking at the very heart of the system. One of the most chilling aspects of Fairchild's findings was the realization that Daniel was not simply acting out of personal vengeance. He was operating within a larger framework of resistance that spanned across the South. Daniel was not a lone figure. He was part of a larger movement, one that was organized, patient, and relentless. The killings were not random acts of violence, but part of a calculated campaign to eliminate those who had perpetuated the system of slavery. And though Daniel had remained largely invisible to the authorities, he had managed to strike fear into the hearts of the Southern elite. His actions were a direct challenge to the notion that the system of slavery was invulnerable and unassailable. Despite his best efforts, however, Fairchild could never catch Daniel. By the time he submitted his report in 1841, Daniel had already vanished once again, disappearing into the landscape of the South like a ghost. Fairchild's report, though thorough and well-reasoned, failed to provide concrete evidence of Daniel's involvement in the deaths. There was no confession, no eyewitnesses, and no physical evidence to link him directly to the killings. All that Fairchild had was a pattern, an eerie, undeniable pattern of deaths that followed Daniel's movements from plantation to plantation. But this was not enough to convince the authorities to take action. The Southern elite were unwilling to admit that their system of control had been breached, and Fairchild's report was ultimately dismissed as inconclusive. This failure to capture Daniel, despite the best efforts of Fairchild and local law enforcement, speaks to the larger theme of resistance within the system of slavery. The fact that someone could move through the Southern landscape, targeting the worst perpetrators of the system, without ever being caught, is a testament to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the enslaved population. Daniel's ability to operate invisibly, to strike without being detected, demonstrates the vulnerabilities that existed within the system of slavery. It was not just the cruelty of the system that kept enslaved people in bondage. It was also their ability to resist, to fight back, and to evade the very authorities that sought to control them. Fairchild's investigation also highlights the ways in which the Southern elite attempted to bury the truth about the resistance of the enslaved population. The deaths, though suspicious, were largely ignored or dismissed because they threatened the narrative that the system of slavery was an unbroken chain of power, with the white elite at the top and the enslaved people at the bottom. The idea that enslaved individuals could organize, could resist, and could strike back against their oppressors was not a narrative that plantation owners and the Southern aristocracy wanted to entertain. And so, the deaths were written off as accidents, as the result of natural causes, or as the work of some anonymous killer. The true nature of the resistance, the coordinated campaign to bring down the institution of slavery, was buried under layers of denial and willful ignorance. Amos Fairchild's investigation into the mysterious deaths in the South was an important moment in the history of resistance to slavery. Though he failed to capture Daniel, his work exposed the vulnerabilities of the system and brought attention to the larger resistance movement that was taking place in the shadows of the South. Daniel's story, as recounted by Fairchild and others, reveals the power that enslaved people had to challenge their oppressors, even in a system as brutal and dehumanizing as slavery. The fact that these killings continued, despite the best efforts of the Southern elite to suppress them, speaks to the resilience and determination of the enslaved people who fought back in ways that were both visible and invisible, both violent and subtle.